autumn of 1879, the most celebrated author alive sat alone in his study and began hiding the ropes, not misplacing them, not storing them elsewhere for practical reasons, but deliberately removing them from his own reach because he no longer trusted himself in their presence. He avoided his hunting rifle for the same reason. Leo Tolstoy, 51 years old, author of War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, master of Yasnaya Polyana, husband, father, the man whose letters of admiration arrived from every corner of the civilized world, had concluded that existence was no longer bearable. This was not grief, it was not madness, and it was not failure. It was the opposite of failure. Every ambition a man of his class and century could reasonably hold, Tolstoy had fulfilled and surpassed. The literary immortality his generation dreamed of was already his. The wealth, the estate, the family, the fame, all present, all intact. And yet something had collapsed beneath him that no achievement could rebuild. I felt that something had broken within me on which my life had always rested, he wrote, that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. What had broken was not his circumstances, but his capacity to believe that circumstances mattered. He had begun asking a question he could not stop asking. Is there any meaning in my life that will not be destroyed by my inevitable death? And the harder he thought, the more clearly the answer seemed to be no. Everything he had built, everyone he loved, every word he had written, all of it moving on a fixed trajectory toward obliteration. The question was not morbid self-pity but ruthless logic. If death annihilates everything, then what, honestly, is the point of any of it? What makes this crisis remarkable is not that Tolstoy suffered it but that he refused to look away from it. Most people who brush against this question find ways to retreat, into work, into pleasure, into the comfortable assumption that surely there must be an answer, even if they haven't found it yet. Tolstoy would not retreat. He had spent his entire life following inconvenient truths wherever they led, from the peasant hovels of his childhood estate to the battlefields of Crimea, and he was constitutionally incapable of stopping now. The same relentless honesty that had made him the greatest novelist of his age was now, with perfect consistency, eating him alive. He was not the first person to face this abyss, but he was perhaps uniquely positioned to do something with it. Because what Tolstoy eventually found on the other side of that darkness, the answer he arrived at, after years of intellectual and spiritual struggle, was not consolation, but transformation. Not a reason to tolerate life despite its meaninglessness, but a complete reconstruction of what meaning is, where it comes from, and what it demands of a person who takes it seriously. That reconstruction would cost him almost everything he had spent the first half of his life accumulating. It would put him at war with the church, the state, and his own family. It would make him one of the most dangerous thinkers of the 19th century to those in power, and one of the most vital to those who had none. But it begins here, in this study, with a man who has hidden the ropes and is still, somehow, choosing to stay. Part 1. The Aristocratic Seeker. Early Moral Questioning. Count Leo Tolstoy's moral crisis began not with philosophical texts, but with the immediate reality of his childhood estate at Yasnaya Polyana. Walking between the grand manor house where he lived in comfort and the peasant hovels scattered across the same land, young Tolstoy confronted a question that would haunt his entire philosophical development. Why should the accident of birth determine human worth? Here were children his own age, equally capable of laughter, tears, and dreams, yet condemned to lives of backbreaking labor, whilst he enjoyed luxury simply because he emerged from an aristocratic womb rather than a peasant one. This wasn't abstract moral philosophy but lived contradiction. Every meal served by peasant hands, every lesson taught by hired tutors, every moment of leisure purchased by others' toil forced the recognition that his advantages rested on no merit of his own. His early diary entries reveal a young man tormented by unearned privilege, writing with genuine anguish about the moral weight of inherited advantages. The question wasn't whether he deserved comfort, but whether anyone deserved comfort built upon others' deprivation. Even as a child, Tolstoy possessed that rare and dangerous quality, the inability to accept social arrangements as natural simply because they existed. This moral discomfort drove him toward practical experimentation. If aristocratic privilege created moral obligations, perhaps those obligations could justify the system itself through enlightened use. Tolstoy threw himself into reform efforts with the intensity of a scientist testing a hypothesis. He attempted to free his serfs, establishing progressive schools based on the latest educational theories. He introduced improved agricultural methods, better housing, medical care. These weren't mere charitable gestures, but systematic attempts to discover whether paternalistic benevolence could transform inherited privilege from moral burden into moral justification. The results proved more complex than his idealistic young mind had anticipated. Peasants often viewed his educational efforts with suspicion, preferring traditional methods to his innovations. His agricultural improvements met with resistance or indifference. Most troubling of all, the very people he sought to help sometimes seemed to resent his interventions, as if they recognized something he had yet to grasp. That reform from above, however well-intentioned, still maintained the fundamental relationship of superior to inferior that created the problem in the first place. These practical failures forced deeper questioning. Perhaps the issue wasn't bad aristocrats, but aristocracy itself, as a system that corrupted even the most benevolent relationships. Here, Rousseau's writings provided the theoretical framework that crystallized Tolstoy's growing insights. Rousseau's famous declaration that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains offered a radical interpretation of Tolstoy's direct observations. The chains weren't merely political or economic, but psychological and moral, binding both oppressor and oppressed in relationships that violated natural human equality. Rousseau's critique of artificial inequality resonated powerfully with Tolstoy's experience of social hierarchies' arbitrary nature. If natural man possessed inherent goodness and dignity, then civilization itself, not merely its abuses, stood accused of corrupting that goodness through artificial distinctions of rank and privilege. This reading suggested that Tolstoy's reform efforts failed, not through poor execution, but because they attempted to humanize an inherently dehumanizing system. True moral consistency might require not reforming aristocratic privilege but abandoning it entirely. This realization created profound internal tension. If civilization corrupted natural goodness, where could one find authentic human experience? Military service beckoned as a potential escape from these contradictions, offering the promise of testing oneself against genuine danger rather than the artificial challenges of salon society. Yet even this apparent solution carried its own moral complications, as service to the state meant serving the very system of organized violence that maintained aristocratic privilege in the first place. Tolstoy's decision to join the military in the Caucasus represented far more than youthful adventure or patriotic duty. It was a deliberate philosophical experiment, an escape from what he increasingly saw as the suffocating artificiality of aristocratic life into what he desperately hoped would constitute genuine human experience. The drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, with their elaborate social rituals and literary conversations, had begun to feel like an elaborate theatrical performance, where everyone knew their roles but no one questioned the script. In his letters from this period, Tolstoy described an almost physical relief at leaving behind the conventions that governed every interaction amongst his class. The careful positioning in society, the endless attention to reputation, the way genuine feelings seemed impossible when every emotion had to be filtered through social expectation. Military service promised something entirely different: the harsh clarity of frontier warfare, where survival depended not on mastering social codes, but on understanding fundamental human realities. Tolstoy romanticized this prospect, imagining that in confronting danger and death, he would finally discover what truly matters in human existence, stripped of pretense and cultural overlay. This wasn't merely escapism, but a philosophical quest, driven by his growing conviction that authentic experience required extreme circumstances to reveal itself. He believed that only by facing mortality directly could he ground his understanding of life in something more substantial than inherited privilege and social convention. The Crimean War, particularly his experiences during the siege of Sevastopol, transformed this romantic notion into devastating philosophical awakening. Witnessing death became not abstract contemplation but immediate, visceral reality. Young soldiers died from random artillery shells, friends perished in poorly planned assaults that achieved nothing, and the arbitrary nature of survival forced Tolstoy to confront mortality as the fundamental condition of human existence. His war writings capture the strange psychological mixture of terror and exhilaration that battle produces, moments when extreme danger strips away everything except essential human responses, revealing both the fragility of individual life and the profound bonds that emerge between people facing death together. These experiences taught him that authentic human connection arises not from shared culture, education, or social position, but from shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. In the trenches, aristocratic officers and peasant soldiers became equals in their mortality, and this equality produced relationships more genuine than anything he had experienced in civilized society. The artificial barriers that seemed so important in peacetime, class distinctions, educational differences, cultural refinements, dissolved under the immediate necessity of survival. What remained was something Tolstoy found both terrifying and exhilarating: human beings relating to each other without mediation, without the protective layers of social convention. Returning to aristocratic society after military service only intensified these insights through contrast. The elaborate etiquette, the literary discussions, the careful social positioning, all of it now appeared not merely trivial, but actively false, a systematic avoidance of the fundamental questions that war had forced him to confront. The very refinements that his class considered marks of civilization seemed designed to distance people from essential human truths. This realization planted the seeds of a profound philosophical problem that would haunt Tolstoy for decades. If the most barbaric circumstances could produce more authentic human relationships than the most civilized ones, what does this reveal about the nature and value of cultural progress itself? His growing literary success, rather than resolving these questions, would only make them more urgent and inescapable. The supreme irony of Tolstoy's position by the 1870 was that achieving everything the world considers ultimate success had intensified rather than resolved his spiritual emptiness. War and Peace and Anna Karenina had secured his place among literature's immortals. International fame brought letters of praise from across Europe and America. His novels generated vast wealth, ensuring financial security for generations. Yet sitting in his study at Yasnaya Polyana, surrounded by testimonials to his genius, Tolstoy felt more hollow and meaningless than ever before. Success, he confessed, acted like a soporific that temporarily distracted from, but ultimately deepened his sense of life's fundamental futility. This created a philosophical puzzle more disturbing than any failure could have been. If getting what everyone wants leaves one feeling more empty, What does this reveal about the nature of human desires and cultural achievements themselves? The contradiction became unbearable because creating art about life's meaning, whilst personally experiencing meaninglessness, exposed the gap between artistic insight and lived wisdom. Writing War and Peace had required him to articulate profound truths about history, death, and human purpose. The novel's philosophical meditations on the meaning of existence resonated with readers worldwide who found spiritual guidance in its pages. Yet these very insights seemed to contradict his own lived experience of despair. The irony was inescapable. Readers discovered deep meaning in novels written by a man privately struggling with suicidal thoughts. This wasn't merely personal hypocrisy, but a revelation about the nature of cultural achievement itself. Perhaps even the most profound artistic work served primarily as elaborate distractions from rather than genuine engagements with life's essential questions. This realization proved more disturbing than simple failure would have been. Failure might be overcome through greater effort or different approaches, but success that feels fundamentally empty suggests the goals themselves are flawed. Tolstoy began to suspect that literary achievement, like aristocratic privilege before it, represented another form of artificial life that separated him from authentic existence. His novels, despite their undeniable artistic merit, might be complicit in the very cultural artificiality he had begun to critique. They entertained and instructed readers, certainly, but did they transform them? Or did they merely provide sophisticated distraction from the hard questions of how to live? Having exhausted the possibilities of reform through aristocratic benevolence, authentic experience through military service, and cultural achievement through literary success, Tolstoy faced the fundamental question of whether life itself contained any meaning that could survive honest examination. Each path had revealed its own form of emptiness. Aristocratic charity had proven superficial, military glory illusory, artistic immortality hollow. He had tested every arrangement his world offered. None of it held. What remained was the one question he could no longer avoid. Is there any meaning in my life that will not be destroyed by my inevitable death? Part 2. The Great Crisis. Confronting Meaninglessness. Tolstoy's crisis was not depression in any ordinary sense. This was something far more dangerous, the intellectually honest recognition that death renders all human achievement ultimately pointless. At 48, with wealth, fame, and a loving family, if he would die, and everyone he loved would die, and eventually all human civilization would end, then what lasting significance could any action or achievement possibly possess? The realization arrived, as he described it, like a physical pain that made ordinary activities feel absurd. Why write another novel that would eventually be forgotten? Why care for family members who would die? Why pursue any goal that death would ultimately negate? This clarity, rather than confusion, made his crisis more perilous than typical despair. He couldn't dismiss these thoughts as irrational melancholy because they followed logically from premises he couldn't deny. The syllogism was simple and devastating. All human endeavors are temporary. Death makes all temporary things meaningless. Therefore, all human endeavors are meaningless. Unlike emotional depression, which might lift with time or treatment, Tolstoy's crisis was based on reasoning that seemed unassailable. The intellectual nature of his despair cut him off from the usual consolations. He couldn't lose himself in work, family, or social activities because he had seen through their ultimate futility. His famous analogy captures this horror perfectly. Life is like a fairy tale about a man who falls into a well, grabs a branch to save himself, but then notices mice gnawing through the branch, whilst a dragon waits below. and one saw that one was perishing miserably. This metaphor reveals the terror of clear-sighted recognition that all human efforts to create meaning and security are temporary measures that cannot address the fundamental problem of mortality. Normal life began to feel like elaborate self-deception, a collective agreement to ignore the obvious. The failure of rational philosophy and science to provide answers only deepened the abyss. Tolstoy systematically consulted the greatest thinkers, reading Kant, Schopenhauer, and contemporary scientists, only to discover that they either avoided the question of life's meaning entirely or concluded, like Schopenhauer, that existence is fundamentally suffering. Philosophy, which promised rational answers to fundamental questions, either dissolved into technical puzzles irrelevant to human life, or confirmed his despair with sophisticated arguments for pessimism. This revealed a central paradox that would define his entire crisis. The very rationality that brought him to this point of clarity about meaninglessness also prevented him from accepting irrational consolations that might work for others. Yet reason alone offered no escape from the abyss it had revealed. He was trapped between the intellectual honesty that made him see through comforting illusions and the desperate need for some foundation that could make life worth living. The tools of rational analysis that had made him a great novelist had become instruments of his own spiritual destruction. Tolstoy's confrontation with meaninglessness demanded a response. Having recognized that all human activity leads ultimately to death and oblivion, he found himself facing 4 possible paths forward. Each represented a different way of dealing with the terrible knowledge that life, viewed rationally, appeared utterly without purpose. The first response was ignorance, the path of those who never ask ultimate questions at all. Tolstoy observed this approach amongst peasants absorbed in daily survival, merchants consumed by their businesses, aristocrats lost in social rituals. These people lived without philosophical reflection, remaining immersed in immediate concerns and practical activities. They married, raised children, pursued wealth or status, and died without ever pausing to question whether any of it mattered in the cosmic scheme. Tolstoy recognized a profound truth here. Ignorance of life is the happiness of life. Those who don't think deeply about mortality and ultimate meaning often seem more content than philosophers. The peasant plowing his field doesn't torture himself with questions about whether his labor serves any eternal purpose. Yet this path remained closed to Tolstoy. Having once seen the problem clearly, he couldn't unsee it. The philosophical awakening that revealed life's apparent meaninglessness couldn't be reversed through an act of will. To pretend otherwise would constitute bad faith, a deliberate self-deception that would compound rather than solve the fundamental problem. Intellectual honesty, once achieved, makes willful ignorance impossible. The second response was pleasure-seeking, the Epicurean path of maximizing immediate gratification. If life has no ultimate meaning, why not at least enjoy the sensations it offers? Tolstoy had witnessed this approach amongst wealthy contemporaries who pursued luxury, sexual pleasure, artistic refinement, and social success as ends in themselves. They acknowledged meaninglessness but chose to gild their prison rather than escape it. This response possessed a certain intellectual respectability. It faced the truth about existence, whilst choosing to make the best of a bad situation. However, Tolstoy recognized fatal flaws in this approach. Pleasure-seeking requires constant escalation to maintain satisfaction. What once brought joy becomes routine, demanding ever greater stimulation. The wealthy libertine needs increasingly exotic experiences. The aesthete requires more refined art. The social climber seeks higher status. Eventually, boredom and emptiness return despite all efforts. Moreover, this entire project depends on the very life that the person has already recognized as meaningless. It's like decorating a house whilst knowing it sits on quicksand. The fundamental problem remains unaddressed. The third response was suicide, the most logically consistent conclusion to his crisis. If life truly has no meaning, if all human effort leads only to death and oblivion, why continue the charade? Is less than #0. 5 is greater than suicide represented intellectual honesty, carried to its ultimate conclusion, rather than live in contradiction. Recognizing meaninglessness whilst continuing to act as if life mattered, one could simply end the futile existence. Tolstoy seriously contemplated this path. He hid ropes and avoided his hunting rifle because the temptation was so strong and the logic so compelling. Suicide seemed like the choice of the strongest and most consistent thinkers, those who refuse to live with philosophical contradiction. If existence has no purpose, continuing to exist becomes an act of cowardice or self-deception. Yet something prevented him from taking this final step. Some instinctive attachment to life, some intuition that his reasoning might be incomplete, held him back. This hesitation created space for examining the fourth response: faith. Perhaps the simple people who found meaning in life possessed knowledge that his rational analysis had missed. Perhaps the very fact that life seemed worth living to millions of human beings suggested that his philosophical conclusions, however logically rigorous, had overlooked something essential about the nature of existence itself. The breakthrough in Tolstoy's crisis came not through philosophical insight but through observation. Around him, he noticed something that shattered his assumptions about wisdom and enlightenment. The simple masses, peasants, laborers, ordinary believers, possessed something that had eluded him entirely. They faced the same mortality that tormented him, yet they lived with genuine peace and meaning. These people, whom he had previously considered less sophisticated and enlightened, actually possessed something essential that all his education and philosophical sophistication had failed to provide. Tolstoy watched peasants face death with calm acceptance. He observed them live with purpose despite poverty and hardship, maintaining hope and joy in circumstances that would drive educated people to despair. The old woman who cleaned his house spoke of her impending death without the existential terror that gripped him. The farmer who worked his land found satisfaction in his daily labor that no amount of literary success had brought Tolstoy. The village priest, despite his simple theology, radiated a contentment that the greatest philosophical minds seemed to lack. This observation presented a paradox that began to crack open his crisis. Those with the least education and cultural refinement had what philosophy couldn't deliver: a sense that life was worth living despite its difficulties and ultimate termination in death. The very people he had been taught to regard as ignorant possessed the one thing that mattered most: the ability to find meaning in existence. Yet Tolstoy's initial response was resistance. His intellectual pride and rational training rebelled against what seemed like an obvious conclusion. His philosophical education had taught him to dismiss religious belief as superstition. How could he, with his sophisticated understanding of literature, philosophy, and human nature, turn to what appeared to be naive faith? The very suggestion felt like intellectual suicide, a betrayal of everything that made him who he was. This created an internal struggle between his desperate need for meaning and his educated skepticism about religious claims. He found himself caught between two impossibilities: continuing to live without meaning, or accepting answers that seemed to contradict everything he had learned about rational inquiry. The contradiction tormented him. If religious belief was merely ignorance and wishful thinking, why did it produce better practical results, more peace, purpose, and resilience than sophisticated philosophy? His growing suspicion was that his intellectual training, rather than making him more enlightened, might have cut him off from sources of wisdom that simpler people still accessed. This possibility was deeply humbling. Perhaps his crisis of meaning was not a sign of his superior insight, but a product of his education. Perhaps the very tools he had used to understand the world, rational analysis, scientific skepticism, philosophical sophistication, were precisely what prevented him from finding what he most needed. This recognition led to a dawning realization that would transform his entire approach to the question of meaning. Reason alone might be insufficient for addressing ultimate questions about life's purpose. Rational analysis, whilst powerful for understanding the material world, might be the wrong tool for grappling with questions of value, meaning, and purpose. These were not problems to be solved through logical deduction, but realities to be lived through commitment and faith. The insight both terrified and attracted him. It terrified him because it seemed to require abandoning the intellectual honesty that defined his identity. How could he embrace beliefs that he could not rationally justify? Yet it attracted him because it offered a potential escape from the logical prison of meaninglessness. If meaning was not something to be discovered through analysis, but something to be created through faith, then perhaps there was a way forward. Tolstoy began to consider that he might need to approach the question of life's meaning not as a philosophical problem to be solved, but as an existential challenge to be lived. This shift in perspective would prove revolutionary. Instead of asking whether religious claims were true in some abstract sense, he began asking whether they were life-giving. Instead of demanding rational proof, he began considering practical wisdom. The Christianity he had dismissed as intellectual superstition began to appear as something else entirely, a way of living that might restore meaning to existence. Tolstoy's creation of Ivan Ilyich stands as one of literature's most powerful explorations of existential crisis, serving as a fictional mirror for the author's own confrontation with mortality and meaninglessness. Through this character, Tolstoy crafted a vehicle for examining the profound transformation from artificial to authentic existence, embedding his personal spiritual struggle within a narrative that could illuminate the universal human condition. Ivan Ilyich emerges as the perfect embodiment of conventional success, a respected judge who has devoted his entire existence to career advancement, social status, and material comfort. He represents precisely the kind of life that society celebrates as admirable and worthwhile, climbing steadily through the ranks of respectability whilst accumulating the markers of achievement that define a successful man in his world. Yet Tolstoy's genius lies in revealing how this seemingly exemplary existence becomes a profound spiritual trap. Ivan Ilyich's terminal illness forces him to confront the same terrifying questions that had tormented Tolstoy during his own crisis. If death renders everything temporary, what was the genuine point of all his professional achievements? His social climbing, his careful cultivation of respectability. The story's central insight cuts to the heart of this dilemma, showing how Ivan Ilyich's entire successful life was built upon lies and social conventions that crumble completely when faced with the stark reality of mortality. His illness strips away the comfortable illusions that had sustained his sense of purpose, leaving him face to face with the possibility that his whole existence might have been fundamentally meaningless. The moment of Ivan Ilyich's recognition that his entire life had been wrong represents one of literature's most devastating psychological revelations. This isn't merely a matter of having made poor choices or pursuing the wrong career, but rather the agonizing understanding that his life had been fundamentally misdirected toward false goals and artificial values from the very beginning. His approaching death becomes a merciless teacher, systematically dismantling all the social roles and cultural achievements that had previously defined his identity. The professional success, the social standing, The material acquisitions that had seemed so important suddenly revealed themselves as elaborate constructions with no genuine substance when viewed from the perspective of mortality. Tolstoy captures this terror through the story's haunting image of Ivan Ilyich being pushed into a black sack, a metaphor that represents his horror at discovering the meaninglessness of his conventional life. This image embodies the existential dread that accompanies the recognition that everything one has lived for might be fundamentally hollow. Yet Tolstoy reveals that this recognition, though agonizing beyond description, becomes the essential beginning of authentic existence. Only by fully acknowledging the falseness of his previous life can Ivan Ilyich begin to discover what might be genuinely true and valuable. The destruction of his artificial identity, painful as it is, clears the ground for something real to emerge, is less than #0. Jinghao Dayu. The story's climactic insight demonstrates that facing death honestly becomes the gateway to discovering life's true meaning. In Ivan Ilyich's final moments, rather than finding despair, he experiences unexpected peace and even joy. His acceptance of death paradoxically reveals what makes life genuinely worth living. Not the social achievements and material accumulations he had pursued so relentlessly, but the simple human connections and capacity for love that he had systematically neglected in his climb toward respectability. The dying man discovers that meaning had been available to him all along, but he had been too busy pursuing false goals to recognize it. Tolstoy's conclusion transforms Ivan Ilyich dying into a moment of spiritual birth. The character finally understands that meaning comes not from avoiding death, but from living authentically in its presence. This fictional exploration allowed Tolstoy to work through his own existential crisis, demonstrating that confronting meaninglessness completely, rather than fleeing from it, can become the foundation for discovering genuine meaning. The story reveals that the terror of meaninglessness, when fully experienced rather than avoided, can catalyze a profound spiritual transformation that makes authentic life possible for the first time. Part 3. Religious Conversion. The Kingdom of God is within you. Tolstoy approached the Gospels with the methodical precision of a scholar determined to bypass 2 millennia of theological interpretation. He sat with the Greek New Testament, deliberately ignoring the accumulated wisdom of church fathers, orthodox doctrine, and Western philosophical tradition. This wasn't mere intellectual curiosity but urgent necessity. He needed to encounter Jesus' actual words without the filter of institutions that claimed divine authority, whilst demonstrating little resemblance to their founders' teachings. The Orthodox Church that had shaped Russian culture for centuries suddenly appeared to him as an elaborate barrier between believers and the very figure they claimed to follow. This direct engagement revealed something extraordinary. Reading the Gospels as philosophical texts, rather than religious dogma, Tolstoy discovered a moral teacher whose insights transcended their historical context entirely. Jesus emerged not as a supernatural savior promising otherworldly rewards, but as a revolutionary philosopher offering practical guidance for human living. The question shifted from whether one could believe in miracles to whether Jesus' moral teachings provided a viable foundation for existence. This transformation in perspective changed everything. Instead of wrestling with theological mysteries, Tolstoy found himself confronting clear ethical imperatives that demanded immediate response. The Jesus he encountered through direct textual engagement was a radical critic of artificial social hierarchies and cultural pretensions. His condemnation of wealth, power, and social status provided religious authority for insights Tolstoy had reached through philosophical analysis. Here was validation from the highest spiritual source that the comfortable assumptions of civilized society were fundamentally corrupt. Jesus' emphasis on inner transformation rather than external observance resonated perfectly with Tolstoy's conviction that authentic change must begin with individual consciousness. This wasn't escape from the world, but the most practical and realistic approach to living in it. The Sermon on the Mount emerged as the essential core of this teaching, stripped of supernatural elements and theological complications. Tolstoy read, "Blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, and resist not evil," not as impossible ideals or metaphorical suggestions, but as practical instructions that could be implemented immediately. These weren't counsels of perfection for saints, but operational principles for anyone serious about living authentically. The revolutionary insight was that these teachings, far from being impractical, offered the only realistic solution to the cycles of violence and competition that made social existence miserable for everyone involved. Resist not evil became the revolutionary center of Christian teaching as Tolstoy understood it. This wasn't passive submission to injustice, but active spiritual force that transforms both the practitioner and the social relationships it touches. The person who refuses to respond to violence with violence doesn't simply avoid contributing to destructive cycles, but introduces an entirely different dynamic into human interaction. This principle challenged every assumption about how power operates and how conflicts must be resolved, pointing toward a completely different way of organizing human relationships. Tolstoy's religious conversion crystallized around a startling discovery. Christianity, stripped of institutional accretions, could be distilled into 5 precise commandments that functioned less like religious doctrine than practical psychology. These weren't mystical imperatives requiring faith, but empirically testable principles anyone could apply and observe the results. Do not be angry. Do not commit adultery. Do not swear oaths. Resist not evil. Love your enemies. Each commandment addressed specific mechanisms by which conventional social behavior perpetuates conflict and prevents authentic human relationships. The first 3 commandments targeted the psychological roots of social discord. Anger, Tolstoy recognized, transforms every disagreement into personal warfare, making rational resolution impossible. Adultery destroys the trust that makes intimate relationships viable, whilst oath-taking binds individuals to abstract loyalties that override present moral judgment. But these preparatory commandments led toward the revolutionary center. Resist not evil. This 4th commandment struck Tolstoy as the most radical insight in human moral thinking. If taken seriously, it would transform not merely individual behavior, but entire social structures built on the assumption that evil must be opposed with force. Every legal system, every government, every social institution operated on the principle that wrongdoing requires coercive response. Yet Tolstoy's analysis revealed a devastating paradox. Resistance to evil through violence perpetuates the very evil it claims to oppose. The logic was inescapable. Using force to prevent force, violence to stop violence, creates endless cycles of retaliation and escalation. Each act of violent resistance generates new grievances, new justifications for counter-violence, new enemies committed to revenge. The criminal punished by the state becomes more criminal. The nation attacked in war becomes more militaristic. The child beaten for misbehavior learns that might makes right. Resistance through violence doesn't eliminate evil, but multiplies it geometrically. Yet, resist not evil didn't mean passive acceptance of injustice. Tolstoy discovered that non-resistance was actually the most active and demanding form of spiritual resistance imaginable. Refusing to respond to violence with violence required tremendous inner strength and moral courage. It was far more difficult than fighting back, which merely required physical strength and emotional reaction. Non-resistance demanded constant spiritual vigilance, the ability to maintain one's moral center whilst absorbing aggression without returning it. This principle extended beyond physical violence to encompass all forms of coercion, legal pressure, economic manipulation, social ostracism, used to force compliance. True non-resistance meant refusing to participate in any coercive mechanism, whether as victim or perpetrator. It meant declining to use courts to settle disputes, refusing to call police for protection, rejecting military service, avoiding any institution that ultimately depended on force to achieve its ends. The practical implications were staggering. If non-resistance formed the core of authentic Christian teaching, then genuine Christians could not participate in government, which exists through taxation backed by force. They could not serve as judges, police officers, or soldiers. They could not even vote, since voting meant selecting who would wield coercive power over others. The entire structure of civilized society rested on principles directly opposed to Christian ethics. But Tolstoy's insight went deeper than mere withdrawal from coercive institutions. Nonviolent resistance worked by appealing to the conscience of opponents, forcing them to confront the moral implications of their actions without the distraction of having to defend against counterattacks. When someone responds to violence with violence, the original aggressor can focus on the threat posed by retaliation, avoiding uncomfortable questions about their own behavior. But when violence meets non-resistance, aggressors must face the full moral weight of their actions. This created what Tolstoy recognized as genuine spiritual force. Non-resistance didn't simply avoid evil, but actively transformed the social environment. By breaking cycles of retaliation that kept communities trapped in perpetual conflict, it offered the only practical solution to social problems that actually addressed root causes rather than symptoms. Violence bred violence endlessly, but non-resistance created space for conscience to operate, for genuine understanding to develop, for authentic solutions to emerge from moral rather than coercive foundations. The fifth commandment, love your enemies, completed this revolutionary framework. It wasn't sentimental idealism, but recognition that enemies exist only within systems of resistance and retaliation. When one refuses to resist evil, when one responds to aggression with compassion rather than counter-aggression, the very category of enemy begins to dissolve. Tolstoy's encounter with Jesus' words, "The kingdom of God is within you," transformed his entire understanding of Christianity and provided the solution to his existential crisis. This wasn't metaphorical language about some future paradise or otherworldly destination. Jesus was describing a present state of consciousness, achievable here and now through right living. The kingdom of God represents a fundamental transformation of awareness in which love, rather than fear or self-interest, becomes the organizing principle of consciousness and action. This interpretation revolutionized Tolstoy's relationship with Christian teaching. Instead of promising escape from the world through death, Jesus was offering transformation of this world through inner change. The kingdom of God isn't something you wait for. It's something you enter by aligning your life with love and non-violence. This realization made Christianity immediately practical rather than merely hopeful. You don't need divine intervention or afterlife rewards to experience meaning and peace. These become available the moment you choose to live according to love rather than force. For Tolstoy, this insight finally answered his crisis of meaning. Life has meaning not because of external purposes or future rewards, but because consciousness itself can be transformed. The despair he had experienced came from seeking meaning in achievements, possessions, or social recognition. But meaning emerges naturally when consciousness operates from love rather than ego-driven desires. The kingdom of God is the experience of this transformed awareness, available to anyone willing to abandon the pursuit of personal advantage in favor of genuine care for others. This understanding transforms the relationship between individual consciousness and social reality. The kingdom of God isn't a private, internal experience separate from worldly concerns. It's a way of relating to others that necessarily changes social relationships. When individuals stop participating in violence and coercion, they create space for new forms of human interaction based on voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. Personal transformation becomes the foundation for social transformation rather than separate from it. Tolstoy recognized that you can't transform society without transforming consciousness, but you can't transform consciousness without changing how you relate to others. This insight resolved his earlier frustration with failed reform efforts. He had been trying to change external structures whilst leaving consciousness unchanged. But authentic transformation must work from the inside out. Social reform and spiritual development become inseparable aspects of the same process. This creates a dynamic relationship between personal and political transformation. External reform without inner change proves futile because social institutions reflect the consciousness of the people who participate in them. Violent institutions exist because people accept violence as necessary and legitimate. Lasting social change requires changing this fundamental acceptance rather than simply replacing one set of institutions with another. Individual transformation becomes politically revolutionary when understood correctly. When enough people refuse to participate in coercive institutions, those institutions lose their power and must be replaced by voluntary alternatives. This provides a practical program for social change that avoids the contradictions of violent revolution. Instead of using force to create a non-violent society, the transformation happens through the gradual spread of non-violent consciousness. The kingdom of God spreads not through conquest but through example, creating new possibilities for human relationship that make the old forms of domination obsolete. Part 4. The critique of civilization, artificial versus natural life. Tolstoy's critique of civilization rested upon a profound insight he inherited from Rousseau, yet verified through his own direct observation. Human beings are naturally good, but social institutions systematically corrupt this goodness. This wasn't abstract theorizing for Tolstoy. Living among Russian peasants, he witnessed something that shattered his aristocratic assumptions about human nature and social progress. These people, lacking formal education and cultural refinement, displayed qualities of compassion, honesty, and spiritual wisdom that were remarkably rare among his educated peers. The evidence was everywhere once he learned to see it. Children, before society shaped them through its demands and expectations, naturally exhibited kindness and curiosity. They shared instinctively, helped without being asked, approached the world with wonder rather than suspicion. Yet, civilization systematically destroyed these qualities through competition, artificial hierarchies, and the relentless pursuit of status. Schools taught them to compete rather than cooperate, to value achievement over character, to see others as obstacles rather than companions. This pattern extended beyond childhood. In situations where social pressures were minimal, people naturally cooperated and cared for each other. During crises, when normal social structures broke down, strangers became helpers, class distinctions dissolved, and natural human solidarity emerged. But institutional environments consistently brought out selfishness and cruelty. The same individuals who showed kindness in natural settings became calculating and harsh when operating within systems that rewarded such behavior. Tolstoy's insight challenged the fundamental assumption of his class that education and cultural sophistication represent human improvement. Instead, he recognized a terrible irony. The more refined a society became, the more it seemed to distance people from their natural goodness. This wasn't romantic idealization, but empirical observation that demanded explanation. The mechanism of corruption became clear through careful analysis. Property, government, and cultural refinement created artificial inequality that overrode natural compassion and mutual aid. Private property transformed the earth's common inheritance into exclusive possessions that must be defended against others. What should have been shared abundance became artificial scarcity. Cooperation became competition, and the natural human tendency toward mutual support was redirected into protective selfishness. Government institutionalized this corruption by using force to protect property rights and maintain social hierarchies that contradicted natural human equality. Laws that seemed neutral actually served to preserve advantages gained through historical accidents of birth and circumstance. The state's monopoly on violence ensured that artificial distinctions would be maintained even when they violated every natural instinct toward fairness and mutual care. Cultural refinement completed the corruption in the most insidious way. Art, literature, philosophy became luxuries available only to those whose leisure depended on others' labor. High culture, even when preaching noble ideals, remained complicit in exploitation. The very conditions that made sophisticated artistic and intellectual achievement possible required the systematic denial of such opportunities to the majority. Beauty and truth became privileges rather than common human birthright. These institutions worked together to create false needs and competitive relationships that made authentic human connection nearly impossible. People learned to value things that had no natural significance, whilst ignoring what truly mattered. Status symbols replaced genuine accomplishment, artificial pleasures displaced natural joy, and the complex machinery of civilized life obscured the simple requirements for human flourishing. This analysis led Tolstoy to a radical conviction. Return to authenticity required not just personal change, but rejection of the institutional structures that made authentic relationships impossible. Individual moral improvement within corrupt institutions was largely futile. Good intentions got channeled into harmful outcomes by systems designed to serve artificial rather than natural human needs. A person might sincerely wish to help others, but if they participated in economic systems based on exploitation, their help merely perpetuated the conditions that created the need for help. The problem wasn't bad people, but bad institutions that corrupted even well-intentioned individuals by forcing them to choose between moral consistency and social survival. To maintain their position, people had to participate in systems they knew were wrong. To reject those systems meant social death, economic ruin, isolation from family and community. The institutional framework made virtue practically impossible, whilst making vice practically necessary. This insight transformed Tolstoy's later attempts at simple living and manual labor from personal preferences into philosophical necessities. The 19th century breathed with an almost religious faith in progress. Across Europe and Russia, educated minds embraced the conviction that humanity stood on an ascending path toward inevitable betterment. Railways carved through landscapes that had remained unchanged for centuries, connecting distant cities and remote villages in ways previous generations could never have imagined. Telegraph wires carried messages across continents in hours rather than months. Medical discoveries reduced infant mortality and extended human life. Democratic movements expanded political participation beyond aristocratic circles. Industrial production multiplied the availability of goods that had once been luxuries reserved for the wealthy. This wasn't mere optimism. It was a comprehensive worldview that provided meaning and purpose for an entire generation. Each individual life, however brief and troubled, contributed to humanity's grand upward trajectory toward universal prosperity, enlightenment, and the gradual elimination of suffering through the application of human reason to social problems. Even death seemed less tragic when viewed as a small sacrifice to the great cause of human advancement. For many of Tolstoy's contemporaries, this faith in progress offered exactly what religion had traditionally provided: a sense that individual existence participated in something larger, more significant, and ultimately redemptive. Tolstoy initially found himself drawn to this vision. After his crisis of meaning had shattered his confidence in personal happiness and individual achievement, the idea that his life might serve humanity's broader development offered a potential escape from despair. If he couldn't find purpose in his own satisfaction, perhaps he could discover it in contributing to the species' advancement. The progressive faith seemed to promise that even a meaningless individual existence could acquire significance through its role in the larger story of human improvement. Yet, as Tolstoy observed more carefully, he began to notice a disturbing pattern. Material progress often accompanied moral decline. The same industrial advances that increased production also created factory conditions that reduced human beings to mere components in mechanical processes. Workers who had once possessed diverse skills and maintained some control over their labor found themselves performing repetitive tasks under the supervision of others, their creativity and autonomy sacrificed to efficiency and output. The concentration of wealth that industrialization enabled didn't eliminate poverty, creating new forms of dependence and exploitation whilst generating unprecedented luxury for factory owners and investors. Technological innovations, rather than freeing people from drudgery as promised, frequently intensified labor and created new dependencies on complex systems beyond individual understanding or control. The railway that connected distant places also made local communities dependent on distant markets and vulnerable to economic forces they couldn't influence. The telegraph that enabled rapid communication also accelerated the pace of business and social life in ways that increased anxiety rather than reducing it. Democratic reforms that expanded political participation often provided people with the illusion of control, whilst real power remained concentrated among economic elites who could influence elections through wealth and media ownership. These observations revealed a fundamental error in progressive thinking: the confusion of external change with human development, complexity with improvement, innovation with wisdom. The progressive faith assumed that any change in human capabilities or social arrangements that increased efficiency, speed, or scale necessarily represented advancement. But Tolstoy recognized that this assumption ignored the most crucial question: advancement toward what? If the goal was simply to produce more goods, transmit more information, or enable more people to participate in political processes, then 19th century developments certainly constituted progress. But if the goal was to reduce human suffering, increase genuine happiness, or develop the moral and spiritual capacities that make life meaningful, then much of what civilization celebrated as progress might actually represent regression. This insight led Tolstoy to a radical conclusion: true progress must be spiritual and moral, the expansion of love and consciousness, which may actually require rejecting much of what civilization calls advancement. He came to see that moral progress and material progress often move in opposite directions. The simpler the life, the more space exists for developing compassion, wisdom, and authentic relationships with others. Money transforms the very foundation of human relationship, from direct mutual aid into abstract market transactions that systematically obscure moral responsibility. When we exchange money for goods or services, we participate in a vast network of relationships that remain invisible to us. The wealthy can live in extraordinary luxury without knowing or caring about the conditions of those whose labor produces their comfort. This distance is not accidental. It is money's essential function. Through monetary exchange, the connection between cause and effect becomes invisible. The silk dress, the elaborate meal, the comfortable home, all appear to emerge from simple market transactions rather than from specific human beings working under specific conditions. Tolstoy recognized that money creates artificial scarcity by making access to life's necessities dependent on possession of an abstract medium of exchange rather than on actual abundance or human need. The earth produces enough food, materials exist for adequate shelter, human energy abounds for necessary work, yet people starve, freeze, and suffer want because they lack money. This transforms natural allies into economic rivals. Instead of cooperating to meet genuine needs, people compete for money, which becomes the gateway to everything necessary for life. The system forces competition where cooperation would be natural and beneficial. This monetary mechanism enables exploitation precisely because it creates distance between luxury and suffering. When mediated through market mechanisms, the wealthy person purchasing expensive goods need never confront the reality that their luxury depends on others' deprivation. The money they spend flows through countless intermediaries, making the connection between their comfort and others' hardship invisible. They can maintain clear consciences whilst participating in systems of exploitation because the moral reality of their actions remains hidden behind the veil of market exchange. Property rights compound this corruption by creating false identities based on possession rather than authentic human qualities. People learn to define themselves not by who they are or how they relate to others, but by what they own. This transforms the very foundation of human identity from internal qualities, character, compassion, wisdom, to external possessions that must be constantly defended and expanded. The property owner develops psychological attachment to things rather than people, leading to the defense of possessions even at the cost of human relationships. The institution of inheritance perpetuates this artificial inequality across generations, making social position depend entirely on accidents of birth rather than personal merit or social contribution. Children of the wealthy inherit not just material possessions but social position, educational opportunities, and cultural advantages that have nothing to do with their own qualities or efforts. This creates a permanent class system disguised as individual achievement. Property anxiety, the fear of losing what one owns, or the desire to acquire what others possess, becomes a constant source of psychological suffering that prevents the peace and contentment naturally available to those who own nothing. Education and culture, rather than representing genuine human improvement, often function as sophisticated mechanisms that separate people from authentic experience and the genuine labor that connects them to natural life. Formal education typically trains people for artificial occupations, law, finance, administration, that contribute nothing to actual human welfare, whilst consuming resources produced by others' labor. The lawyer, the banker, the government official all depend entirely on the work of farmers, builders, and craftsmen, yet they consider themselves superior because of their education. Cultural sophistication becomes a form of class distinction that justifies inequality through claims of superior worth. The educated classes assert their value based on refined tastes and intellectual achievements, whilst remaining completely dependent on the physical labor they despise. This creates false needs that multiply endlessly: the pursuit of cultural status, intellectual novelty, aesthetic refinement, generating perpetual dissatisfaction and competition. The cultured person becomes trapped in an endless cycle of artificial desires that can never be satisfied because they have no connection to genuine human needs. These mechanisms work together to create lives organized around artificial goals that prevent people from discovering their authentic needs and capabilities. Money, property, and culture combine to produce human beings who have lost touch with natural life, who define themselves through possessions and status rather than through genuine relationships and meaningful work. They become strangers to their own nature, pursuing goals that bring no real satisfaction, whilst remaining ignorant of the simple activities and relationships that could provide genuine contentment and peace. Part 5. Christian Anarchism. The rejection of coercive authority. Tolstoy's spiritual awakening through the Gospels led him to a startling recognition. Genuine Christianity necessarily culminates in anarchism. This wasn't a political conclusion reached through secular reasoning, but a religious insight emerging directly from his careful reading of Jesus' teachings. The core Christian principle of love, he discovered, stands in absolute contradiction to the coercive authority that defines all government. Jesus consistently rejected political power throughout his ministry, refusing the crown when offered, declaring his kingdom not of this world, and teaching his followers to render unto Caesar only what belongs to Caesar, whilst implying that nothing ultimately belongs to Caesar. Most crucially, Jesus explicitly rejected the use of force, even in self-defense, commanding his followers to love your enemies and warning that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. These weren't mere ethical suggestions, but fundamental principles that create an unbridgeable chasm between Christian discipleship and governmental participation. This revelation forced Tolstoy to confront an uncomfortable truth. You cannot simultaneously follow Jesus' commandment to love all people and participate in institutions that systematically use violence against some people. Government, by its very nature, represents institutionalized violence. Every governmental action, however benevolent its stated intention, ultimately depends on the willingness to use force against those who refuse to comply. Taxes are collected at gunpoint, laws are enforced through imprisonment. Even the most democratic and humanitarian government functions through coercive power, threatening punishment for non-compliance with its decisions. This makes government participation impossible for genuine Christians, because you cannot love your neighbor while simultaneously threatening to imprison or kill them for disobedience. The contradiction extends beyond direct violence to encompass all forms of coercive authority. Courts impose judgments on unwilling parties, police enforce compliance through threat of force, and militaries defend national interests through organized violence. Tolstoy realized that recognizing this fundamental incompatibility forced a stark choice between Christian consistency and social respectability. There could be no middle ground, no accommodation between the Gospel's absolute demand for love and the state's absolute dependence on coercion. This insight led Tolstoy to reject all political involvement whatsoever. Voting, serving on juries, paying taxes, and accepting government benefits all make one complicit in the system of institutionalized violence that contradicts Christian love. He concluded that Christians must refuse all cooperation with government rather than attempting to reform it from within, because the problem isn't bad government but government itself as organized coercion. The very attempt to improve government through democratic participation legitimizes the coercive system that Christianity must reject. This position isolated Tolstoy from both conservative supporters of traditional authority and liberal reformers who sought to improve government through democratic participation. Conservatives accused him of undermining social order, whilst liberals dismissed him as unrealistic and politically naive. Yet Tolstoy remained convinced that this isolation proved the authenticity of his insight. True Christianity, he argued, must always appear unrealistic to worldly wisdom because it operates according to entirely different principles. The betrayal ran deeper than individual compromise. Tolstoy recognized that churches themselves had abandoned Christianity by accommodating political power, blessing wars, supporting governments, and teaching obedience to earthly authorities. This accommodation transformed Christianity from a revolutionary spiritual force into a conservative social institution, neutering its transformative power and making it complicit in the very violence Jesus rejected. The state had successfully co-opted Christianity, turning it into an instrument of social control rather than spiritual liberation. Government authority, Tolstoy recognized with startling clarity, rests entirely on violence. Behind every law, every tax, every regulation stands the implicit threat: obey, or we will force you to comply. This is not hyperbole but simple fact. When citizens refuse to pay taxes, agents of the state will seize their property. If they resist this seizure, they will be imprisoned. If they resist imprisonment with sufficient determination, they will be killed. Every government action, from the most trivial municipal ordinance to the grandest constitutional principle, derives its power from this ultimate willingness to inflict harm on those who disobey. This insight cuts through all political rhetoric about democracy, justice, and the common good to reveal the violent foundation underlying every government action. Tolstoy saw that taxation amounts to legalized theft, money taken under threat of force, whilst law enforcement constitutes a system of legalized kidnapping and assault that would be recognized as criminal if performed by private individuals. The democratic process may determine who wields this power and how it's exercised, but it cannot change its essential character. Even the most liberal and humanitarian governments depend on this capacity for violence, making the form of government irrelevant to its fundamental nature as organized coercion. Consider the profound moral contradiction this creates. Government claims to prevent violence through violence, to create peace through force, to teach respect for others through threats of harm. Yet violence breeds violence regardless of who initiates it or for what noble purpose. When the state uses force against criminals, it normalizes violence as an acceptable solution to human problems and teaches citizens that coercion is legitimate when exercised by proper authority. How can institutions based on violence create a peaceful society? How can threatening people with harm teach them to treat each other with love and respect? This contradiction traps society in endless cycles of coercion and resistance. Government violence, even when directed against genuinely harmful people, perpetuates the very evil it claims to oppose. Citizens learn that force is acceptable when used by those with proper credentials, undermining the moral foundation necessary for genuine social cooperation. The problem, Tolstoy realized, isn't bad government but government itself as a system that corrupts both rulers and ruled. Political power attracts those who enjoy dominating others, whilst corrupting even well-intentioned people who seek office to do good. The requirements of maintaining power force them to compromise their principles and use violence they initially opposed. Meanwhile, subjection to government authority infantilizes citizens by teaching them to look to external authority rather than their own conscience for moral guidance. This creates dependency and irresponsibility, making people less capable of the self-governance that genuine social order requires. Democratic reform proves largely illusory because changing the personnel or procedures of government doesn't change its essential character as organized violence. Indeed, democracy may make government more dangerous by giving it the appearance of legitimacy whilst preserving its violent core. The only genuine alternative, Tolstoy concluded, lies in voluntary association and moral suasion, cooperation based on love and reason rather than fear and force. Tolstoy's Christian anarchism wasn't merely a critique of existing authority, It was a comprehensive vision of how human society could organize itself through voluntary cooperation rather than coercive compulsion. His conviction rested on a fundamental observation about human nature. People naturally cooperate when not forced into artificial competition by property systems and political hierarchies. Families care for children without government mandate. Neighbors help during emergencies without legal requirement. Communities organize collective projects, create art, develop friendships, and pursue spiritual growth through voluntary association. These essential human activities would be destroyed by coercive interference. Yet they represent the most meaningful and productive aspects of human existence. This wasn't utopian fantasy, but practical extension of existing human capacities. If people can cooperate voluntarily in some areas of life, Tolstoy reasoned, why not in all areas? Government often prevents rather than enables cooperation by creating artificial scarcities, legal barriers, and competitive relationships that make mutual aid difficult or illegal. Property laws prevent people from sharing resources freely. Labor regulations restrict voluntary work arrangements. Military conscription forces people to abandon their communities and families. These institutions don't coordinate human activity. They distort natural cooperative impulses into artificial competition and conflict. Tolstoy's alternative operated through moral influence and personal example rather than political reform or violent revolution. He understood that lasting change must come through transformation of consciousness. People must choose to live differently because they see the value of change, not because new rules force compliance. Political coercion produces only surface conformity that breeds resentment and resistance. Revolutionary violence simply replaces one coercive system with another, perpetuating the cycle of domination whilst claiming to eliminate it. Personal example proved more powerful than political argument. One person living according to love and non-violence demonstrates the possibility of authentic existence more convincingly than any theoretical manifesto. Tolstoy's own experiments in simple living, manual labor, and direct aid to peasants showed others that alternative ways of life were possible. This approach required tremendous patience and faith, trusting that truth and love would eventually prevail without using force to speed the process. Moral influence works slowly, but creates genuine transformation that endures because it springs from internal conviction rather than external pressure. The power of individual conscience, when multiplied across many people, becomes irresistible social force. Government authority depends entirely on popular compliance. If enough people refuse to participate, the system loses its power and must be replaced by voluntary alternatives. Tax resistance undermines government funding. Military draft resistance prevents war. Jury nullification blocks unjust prosecutions. Each act of individual conscience weakens coercive institutions while strengthening voluntary cooperation. This strategy avoided the fundamental contradiction of violent revolution by creating change through withdrawal of consent rather than conquest of power. Every individual becomes a potential agent of social transformation without violating moral principles or harming others. Civil disobedience doesn't seek to control others but to free oneself from complicity in systems of domination. This creates cascading effects as others witness the possibility of living according to conscience rather than compulsion, generating momentum toward examining how these moral forces shape the broader sweep of historical development. Part 6. The Philosophy of History. Great Men versus Moral Forces. The great man theory of history dominated 19th century thinking with compelling simplicity. History unfolds through exceptional individuals who impose their will upon events through superior vision, intelligence, and force of personality. Napoleon reshapes Europe through military genius. Caesar transforms Rome through political acumen. Alexander creates an empire through conquering ambition. This framework made historical chaos comprehensible by providing clear agents of change and identifiable causes for complex events. Wars happen because ambitious leaders initiate them. Social transformations occur because visionary reformers advocate them. Cultural developments emerge because creative geniuses pioneer them. This theory satisfied deep psychological needs for agency and meaning. If exceptional individuals can shape history, then human action matters fundamentally. Events have purposes rather than emerging from blind chance. The framework also justified existing hierarchies by suggesting natural differences in human capacity. Some people possess the vision and strength to lead, whilst others should follow, making political and social inequality seem both natural and necessary. The great man theory thus provided both explanation and justification for the world as it appeared. Tolstoy subjected this comfortable theory to devastating analysis through his examination of Napoleon during the 1812 Russian invasion. Rather than discovering a masterful strategist controlling events, he found a figure swept along by forces beyond his comprehension or control. Napoleon's apparent decisions, when to advance on Moscow, where to position troops, whether to retreat, were largely determined by circumstances he neither created nor understood. Weather patterns, supply line failures, troop morale, enemy movements, and countless other variables shaped his choices far more than any strategic vision. In War and Peace, Tolstoy presents Napoleon as confused and reactive rather than commanding. The French emperor appears bewildered by Russian tactics, surprised by the burning of Moscow, and forced into retreat by circumstances that overwhelmed his planning. Yet historians later constructed narratives that made these responses seem calculated and purposeful. What appeared as masterful strategy was actually improvised reaction to uncontrollable events. The illusion of control emerged retrospectively through storytelling that organized chaos into coherent explanation. This analysis extends far beyond military history. Political leaders operate within constraints that severely limit their actual agency whilst creating appearances of control. Cultural innovators work within intellectual traditions and social conditions that shape their contributions more than individual genius. Social reformers succeed or fail based on historical circumstances that make their ideas timely or premature. The great man theory mistakes the foam on waves for the ocean currents beneath. The illusion arises through narrative construction that makes chaotic events seem planned and attributes to leaders control they never possessed. Historians, writing after outcomes are known, naturally organize random occurrences into stories that explain why things happened as they did. This process systematically overestimates individual agency, whilst underestimating the role of chance, circumstance, and collective forces in shaping historical development. Tolstoy recognized that historical causation involves such complexity, countless variables, feedback loops, unintended consequences, that individual agency, whilst real, operates within constraints that make great men largely illusory as explanations for change. A general's battlefield decisions depend on information systems, troop training, weather conditions, enemy actions, supply situations, and hundreds of other factors beyond his control. A political leader's reforms succeed or fail based on economic conditions, cultural attitudes, institutional structures, and social forces that dwarf individual will. This insight challenged not merely historical methodology, but the entire modern faith in rational human control over social and political development. If supposed shapers of history are actually shaped by forces they don't understand, what does this reveal about the nature of historical change itself? Tolstoy discovered that human history resembles nothing so much as the migration of animals or the swarming of bees. Just as thousands of individual bees follow simple local rules, seeking food, avoiding danger, responding to chemical signals, yet produce the complex, purposeful behavior of the entire hive, human beings make countless individual decisions that collectively generate historical movements no single participant controls or fully comprehends. This insight emerged from his careful observation of how social changes actually occur. Revolutionary upheavals, religious awakenings, cultural transformations. None of these arise from the brilliant schemes of exceptional individuals, despite what our histories suggest. Instead, they emerge gradually through shifts in collective consciousness and behavior, as millions of people independently adjust their beliefs, values, and actions in response to changing circumstances. The individual bee cannot determine where the swarm will settle. Yet, without each bee's contribution, there would be no swarm at all. Tolstoy recognized that human societies exhibit what we might call emergent properties, patterns of behavior that arise from countless individual decisions but cannot be reduced to any individual's intentions or plans. A financial panic spreads not because any single person decides to create economic chaos, but because each person, acting rationally according to their individual circumstances, contributes to a collective behavior that produces results no one wanted or anticipated. Similarly, cultural movements gain momentum not through the vision of singular leaders, but through the accumulated choices of ordinary people who find certain ideas increasingly compelling or certain practices increasingly necessary. This perspective makes individual human actions simultaneously meaningful and constrained. Each person's choices matter and contribute to the overall pattern of historical development. The peasant who decides to read, the merchant who chooses honesty over profit, the soldier who refuses an unjust order. These individual moral decisions ripple through the social fabric in ways that ultimately shape the direction of entire civilizations. Yet no individual can determine the direction of the whole. The most powerful emperor remains subject to forces he cannot control, currents of historical necessity that limit and channel even the most determined personal agency. Tolstoy understood that people make real choices with real consequences, but these choices occur within larger currents that heavily influence what options seem available and desirable. What appears to be free individual decision-making often represents the working out of historical forces through particular personalities. Napoleon did not create the conditions that made his rise possible. He embodied and expressed tendencies already present in French society and European politics. The revolutionary ferment, the military innovations, the social upheavals that enabled his career were already underway when he was born. His genius lay not in creating these forces, but in recognizing and channeling them more effectively than his contemporaries. This creates a complex relationship between freedom and determinism that transcends the usual philosophical categories. Individuals remain free to choose among available options, but the range of options and the criteria for choosing are largely determined by historical circumstances beyond individual control. A medieval peasant could choose between various forms of Christian devotion, but could not choose to become a secular humanist. That option simply did not exist within his cultural horizon. Similarly, a modern person can choose between numerous career paths, but cannot choose to live as a medieval knight. The social structures that made such a life possible have vanished. This understanding makes historical prediction impossible, whilst making historical explanation more nuanced and realistic. We cannot predict what specific form future social changes will take because they depend on countless individual decisions not yet made. But we can understand how past changes occurred by examining the convergence of individual choices within particular historical circumstances. The abolition of serfdom in Russia resulted not from the enlightened decision of a single reformer, but from the accumulated pressure of economic changes, moral awakening, and practical necessities that made the old system increasingly untenable. Yet this recognition of historical necessity does not eliminate individual moral responsibility. Indeed, it makes moral choice both more important and less dependent on external results. While people cannot control historical outcomes, they remain fully responsible for their moral choices and the quality of their individual lives. Historical necessity operates through individual decisions rather than despite them. People freely choose actions that collectively produce outcomes no one intended or foresaw. This makes moral action valuable in itself, regardless of whether it produces the historical outcomes one desires. Tolstoy discovered something remarkable whilst studying the trajectory of human civilization. Despite his profound skepticism about material progress, he found undeniable evidence of genuine moral evolution unfolding across generations. The abolition of slavery provided his most compelling case study. Within a relatively brief historical period, practices that entire civilizations had considered natural and economically necessary, the ownership of human beings, became morally unthinkable to most people. This transformation couldn't be explained by technological advancement or economic necessity alone. Something deeper was occurring: the expansion of human moral consciousness itself. He observed this pattern repeating throughout his own era. Humanitarian sentiment was growing visibly stronger. People increasingly concerned themselves with animal welfare, prison reform, care for the mentally ill, and international efforts to limit warfare's brutality. These developments represented genuine improvements in human moral imagination, making previously acceptable cruelties seem intolerable. Unlike technological change, which merely altered the means of achieving existing goals, moral progress actually transformed what human beings considered worth pursuing. This convinced Tolstoy that moral development represents authentic human improvement that accumulates across generations. The mechanism of this progress fascinated him. Moral advancement occurred not through institutional reform but through individual transformation. Lasting moral progress happened when individuals achieved higher levels of consciousness and compassion, then influenced others through example, creating gradual shifts in collective values and behavior. Institutional changes followed, rather than created moral development. Slavery was abolished because enough people came to see slavery as morally wrong. This understanding made individual spiritual work historically significant. Each person who developed greater capacity for love and nonviolence contributed to humanity's moral evolution in ways that might not be immediately visible but had cumulative historical impact. Tolstoy's own spiritual development felt like participation in humanity's larger evolutionary process. Personal transformation wasn't merely private self-improvement but active contribution to the moral advancement of the species. Certain exceptional individuals played crucial roles in this process by articulating emerging moral consciousness. Prophetic figures like Jesus, Buddha, or Gandhi didn't create new moral truths, but rather gave voice to insights that humanity was ready to receive. They served as lightning rods for moral electricity already present in the historical atmosphere. Their genius lay not in inventing unprecedented ideas but in recognizing and expressing moral developments that were stirring in collective human experience. These prophetic individuals often suffered persecution because they challenged existing moral arrangements, but their ideas eventually prevailed because they expressed humanity's deeper moral development. Moral prophecy was both individually costly and historically necessary. Those who articulated emerging moral consciousness paid personal prices for challenging established systems, but their witness helped accelerate moral progress that would otherwise occur more slowly. This understanding of his own role as moral teacher created both burden and purpose for Tolstoy. He felt called to articulate insights about non-violence and simple living that he believed humanity needed to hear, regardless of personal consequences. His literary fame gave him a platform to serve as moral prophet, translating spiritual insights into accessible language that could influence collective consciousness. The suffering this role brought him, criticism, family conflict, social isolation, seemed justified by its contribution to humanity's moral evolution. Part 7. The Theory of Art. What is art? Tolstoy's revolutionary redefinition of art struck at the very heart of aesthetic philosophy, rejecting centuries of beauty-based theories in favor of a radically different understanding. Art's value lies not in whether it is beautiful, but in whether it successfully transmits genuine human experience from artist to audience. This approach challenged the entire foundation of aesthetic thought that had focused on formal properties, technical skill, or abstract beauty as the criteria for artistic worth. Where previous philosophers had debated the nature of beauty itself, whether it existed objectively in the world or subjectively in the mind, Tolstoy dismissed the question entirely. Beauty, he recognized, is subjective and culturally relative. What one person or culture finds beautiful, another may find ugly or meaningless, making beauty an unreliable standard for evaluating art's true significance. His alternative criterion cut through this philosophical confusion with startling clarity. True art achieves emotional transmission, creating in the audience the same feeling that the artist experienced and sought to express. This redefinition transformed art from a question of aesthetic pleasure into a question of authentic human communication, making artistic evaluation fundamentally about connection rather than taste. Genuine art emerges from authentic personal experience and successfully recreates that experience in others through the artistic medium, creating what Tolstoy understood as a form of spiritual communion between artist and audience. Authentic art begins with the artist's genuine feeling, not manufactured emotion or calculated effect, but real experience that demands expression. This authentic feeling, when skillfully embodied in artistic form, possesses the remarkable power to awaken corresponding feelings in others who encounter the work, creating shared emotional experience across barriers of time, culture. The process works through a kind of emotional contagion. The artist's authentic experience, when successfully transmitted through art, enables others to feel what they might never have felt otherwise, expanding their emotional and spiritual capacity in profound ways. This makes art a form of moral education that operates through feeling rather than argument, potentially transforming consciousness in ways that purely intellectual communication cannot achieve. The artist becomes a conduit for human experience, offering others access to feelings and insights that broaden their understanding of what it means to be human. The crucial distinction between authentic art emerging from real experience and counterfeit art manufactured for effect or commercial success cuts across all conventional categories of high and low culture, revealing uncomfortable truths about artistic hierarchy. Tolstoy recognized that technical skill without genuine feeling produces pseudo-art, work that may impress through craftsmanship, but fails to create authentic human connection because it lacks the emotional truth that makes transmission possible. His most controversial claim challenged the very foundations of cultural authority. Much celebrated great art, including sophisticated works praised by critics and scholars, is actually counterfeit because it serves social pretension rather than human communication. Commercial pressures and elite patronage encourage the production of artificial art designed to flatter audiences or demonstrate cultural sophistication rather than transmit authentic experience. This insight led to his shocking re-evaluation of artistic hierarchy, including harsh self-criticism of his own novels as serving class privilege rather than universal human needs. The sophisticated opera, the refined painting, the literary masterpiece, all might be revealed as elaborate deceptions if they failed the test of genuine emotional transmission, whilst a simple folk song or peasant tale might represent true art if it successfully communicated authentic human feeling. Art, created for wealthy, educated audiences, naturally reflects their refined tastes and sophisticated cultural knowledge, making it inaccessible to ordinary people whilst serving class distinction rather than human communication. Tolstoy recognized that elite art develops specialized vocabularies, complex references, and subtle techniques that require extensive education to appreciate, automatically excluding those without leisure and cultural training. The aristocratic and bourgeois audiences demand novelty, sophistication, and cultural refinement that demonstrates their superior taste and education, creating relentless pressure for artists to produce increasingly complex and esoteric work. This dynamic transforms art from universal human communication into a luxury commodity that reinforces social hierarchies. The ability to appreciate high art becomes a marker of class status, whilst popular art is dismissed as crude and worthless. Tolstoy observed how this corruption occurs even when artists have good intentions. The economic and social pressures of elite patronage shape artistic production in ways that serve class privilege, regardless of individual, artistic goals. The artist, dependent on wealthy patrons or educated consumers, must satisfy their expectations for refinement and distinction, gradually moving away from simple, direct expression toward sophisticated complexity that flatters elite sensibilities. The pursuit of novelty and complexity for its own sake leads inevitably to art for art's sake, valued for technical innovation rather than human truth or moral significance. Elite audiences, having exhausted simpler pleasures, demand increasingly sophisticated and unusual artistic experiences to maintain their interest and demonstrate their refined sensibilities. Tolstoy critiqued artistic movements that prioritize formal experimentation, stylistic innovation, or aesthetic theory over the communication of authentic human experience. This pursuit of novelty creates an endless spiral of complexity and obscurity that moves art further away from universal human concerns toward specialized aesthetic problems that interest only other artists and critics. The result is much modern art becoming incomprehensible and irrelevant to ordinary people, violating art's essential purpose as a means of human communication and moral education. Artists compete to create more daring, more unusual, more technically challenging works that impress sophisticated audiences, whilst remaining meaningless to those who lack the cultural education to decode their references and appreciate their innovations. The art world becomes a closed system serving its own interests rather than humanity's broader needs. Tolstoy reached the shocking conclusion that much great art, including his own novels, is morally worthless because it serves class privilege rather than human brotherhood, challenging fundamental assumptions about cultural value and artistic achievement. He recognized that War and Peace and Anna Karenina, despite their artistic merit and philosophical depth, were written for and consumed by the educated elite, whose leisure depended on the labor of others, making these works complicit in social inequality regardless of their moral content. His literary success had made him wealthy and famous, whilst contributing nothing to the welfare of ordinary people who couldn't read his books or afford to buy them. This painful acknowledgement led to his insight that art serving elite audiences, no matter how technically accomplished or intellectually sophisticated, perpetuates the very social divisions that prevent authentic human community. The most celebrated cultural achievements of his era, including his own masterpieces, functioned as instruments of class distinction rather than human connection. This self-critique drove his search for alternative forms of artistic expression that could serve universal human needs rather than class privilege. Good art, Tolstoy argued, must be accessible to all people, regardless of their education or social position. This accessibility criterion formed the cornerstone of his artistic philosophy, challenging everything the cultured classes believed about aesthetic sophistication. Authentic art speaks to fundamental human experiences that transcend cultural and class boundaries. Love, death, suffering, joy, moral struggle. These experiences belong to every human being, not merely to those with refined taste or extensive education. The best art requires no special preparation to understand because it deals with what all people share or can imagine sharing. A simple folk song that moves everyone who hears it demonstrates superior artistic achievement compared to a complex symphony that only educated audiences can appreciate. This insight overturned conventional artistic hierarchies entirely. Tolstoy valued direct, simple expression over sophisticated techniques precisely because sophistication creates barriers between art and humanity. When art becomes the province of specialists, it loses its essential function, the communication of universal human truth. This vision led Tolstoy to recognize religious art as the highest form, though not necessarily art about religious subjects. Religious art communicates humanity's deepest spiritual insights and promotes moral development rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. Such art serves the most crucial human needs by helping people understand their relationship to ultimate reality and their moral obligations to others. The greatest art throughout history has been religious in this deeper sense. It has advanced humanity's moral and spiritual development by transmitting insights about love, compassion, justice, and existence's meaning. Religious art works by appealing to people's highest aspirations rather than their immediate desires. It encourages moral growth and spiritual development instead of offering entertainment or aesthetic satisfaction. This transformative power distinguishes religious art from purely aesthetic creation. Whilst aesthetic art might provide pleasure or demonstrate technical mastery, religious art contributes to humanity's moral progress. It shapes consciousness toward greater love and understanding, making it socially transformative in ways that mere beauty cannot achieve. This understanding fundamentally transforms the artist's role from entertainer or aesthetic innovator to moral teacher and social servant. Artists possess extraordinary power to influence human consciousness through emotional transmission, creating special responsibility to use their abilities for moral good rather than personal advancement. True artists should create work that promotes love, compassion, and understanding among all people, not work that flatters particular audiences or demonstrates artistic cleverness. Folk art and simple moral tales often achieve superior results compared to sophisticated literary works because they serve universal human needs rather than elite cultural pretensions. The peasant's song that expresses genuine feeling reaches more hearts than the salon piece designed to impress educated listeners. This recognition led Tolstoy to abandon the complex psychological realism that had brought him literary fame, attempting instead to create simple, morally instructive stories accessible to ordinary readers. His artistic philosophy demanded this sacrifice of reputation for the sake of authentic human service. Part 8. The Integration of Life and Teaching. Tolstoy's philosophical crisis reached its most painful expression when he recognized that teaching moral truths whilst living in contradiction to them undermined both the teaching and the teacher's integrity. This wasn't merely intellectual inconsistency, it was a fundamental betrayal of philosophy itself. His growing awareness that moral and religious insights meant nothing if they remained purely intellectual exercises, divorced from daily behavior and life choices, created an anguish that demanded practical resolution. The contradiction tormented him. How could he preach simple living, non-violence, and love, whilst continuing to live as a wealthy aristocrat whose comfort depended entirely on others' labor? His lifestyle embodied the very materialism and inequality he criticized. This wasn't personal guilt but philosophical necessity. If his insights about authentic existence were true, then living inauthentically invalidated the insights themselves. The recognition forced an impossible choice between intellectual consistency and social comfort, making his later life changes not personal preferences, but logical requirements of his philosophical position. Tolstoy's concrete attempts to achieve consistency met fierce resistance from family expectations and social pressures. He began transferring his land to peasants, insisting on performing manual labor despite his age and aristocratic position. He adopted peasant clothing and a vegetarian diet as direct expressions of his philosophical convictions. These weren't symbolic gestures but desperate attempts to align his existence with his understanding. The reforms created intense family conflicts, particularly with his wife Sophia, who saw his changes as threatening their children's inheritance and social position. Every attempt at simplification was complicated by family needs, social expectations, and the practical impossibility of completely withdrawing from the economic and social systems he condemned. His efforts to live simply were constantly undermined by the very structures that made his philosophical work possible. He became a living laboratory for testing whether philosophical insights could be translated into sustainable life practices, and the results were deeply ambiguous. The impossibility of complete individual reform within an unreformed society created ongoing tension and apparent hypocrisy. Yet Tolstoy viewed these moral failures as evidence for, rather than against, his philosophy. His inability to fully live according to his convictions demonstrated how thoroughly artificial social arrangements corrupt natural human goodness. Even someone with clear understanding of what authentic life requires finds it nearly impossible to achieve within existing social structures. This recognition transformed his understanding of moral failure. His personal inconsistencies proved the need for social transformation rather than invalidating his moral vision. The difficulty of living truthfully shows how powerful the forces of corruption are. Not that truthful living is impossible or undesirable. This insight allowed him to continue teaching despite his personal contradictions, viewing himself as a fellow struggler rather than a perfect exemplar. His honest acknowledgement of failure paradoxically strengthened his moral authority by demonstrating the genuine difficulty of the transformation he advocated, whilst maintaining that the goal remained valid and necessary. The struggle for consistency became itself a form of teaching, showing that authentic philosophy demands not perfection but the courage to attempt alignment between belief and practice, even when complete success remains elusive. Tolstoy's estate became a laboratory for testing whether Christian anarchist principles could actually work in practice. Yasnaya Polyana, the ancestral manor that had housed generations of aristocratic privilege, transformed into something unprecedented, an experimental community where voluntary cooperation replaced hierarchical command, where mutual respect superseded the ancient relationships between master and servant, landowner and peasant. The transformation began with deliberate dismantling of aristocratic authority. Tolstoy refused to give orders in the traditional manner, instead asking workers what needed to be done and consulting them about decisions affecting the estate. He shared meals with laborers, sitting at the same table where he had once dined alone or with fellow aristocrats. Most remarkably, he performed manual labor alongside peasants, working in the fields, chopping wood, and participating in the physical work that sustained the community. Visitors from across Europe and America arrived to witness this extraordinary sight. A famous count working with his hands whilst discussing philosophy with peasants, a nobleman who had voluntarily abandoned the privileges of his class. These weren't merely symbolic gestures, but genuine attempts to create relationships based on human dignity rather than economic coercion. The traditional estate operated through clear hierarchies, where peasants obeyed because they needed employment, where servants followed orders because their survival depended on aristocratic approval. Tolstoy sought to replace this system with voluntary cooperation, where people worked together because they recognized their mutual dependence and shared humanity. His educational experiments provided the most concrete evidence that these principles could succeed. The schools he established for peasant children rejected every assumption of traditional pedagogy. Instead of forcing students to memorize predetermined curricula, he allowed them to pursue their interests and learn at their own pace. Rather than using authoritarian methods that treated children as empty vessels to be filled with approved knowledge, he respected their natural development and encouraged critical thinking. These schools operated on the same anarchist principles that guided his social experiments. Just as society should be organized through voluntary cooperation rather than coercive authority, education should develop children's natural capacities rather than forcing them into artificial molds. Students attended classes when they chose, studied subjects that interested them, and learned through exploration rather than compulsion. Teachers became guides and facilitators rather than authoritarian figures demanding obedience. The results vindicated his philosophy. The peasant children who attended these schools developed into confident, capable, and morally developed individuals. They learned practical skills, developed their reasoning abilities, and maintained their natural curiosity about the world. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Most importantly, they retained their human dignity and capacity for independent thought, qualities that traditional education systematically destroyed through its emphasis on conformity and submission to authority. The success of these educational experiments provided crucial evidence that anarchist principles could work in practice. Children, like adults, flourished when treated with respect and given freedom to develop their capacities. The artificial constraints imposed by traditional authority weren't necessary for learning or social cooperation. They were obstacles to human development that served only to maintain existing power relationships. However, the broader social experiments revealed the limitations of individual reform within an unreformed society. Tolstoy's attempts to create non-coercive relationships with peasants and servants achieved partial success, but could never fully transcend the economic and social context that shaped all human interactions. Despite his efforts to treat peasants as equals, the fundamental reality remained that they depended on him for employment, whilst he controlled the land and resources that sustained the community. Some genuine transformations occurred. Real affection and respect developed between Tolstoy and peasants who worked closely with him, relationships that transcended the traditional master-servant dynamic. These connections demonstrated that authentic human relationships were possible, that people could relate to each other as equals deserving mutual consideration rather than as economic units in a hierarchical system. Yet the persistent limitations became equally clear. The broader economic system still forced people into artificial relationships based on property and class. Even Tolstoy's most sincere efforts to eliminate hierarchy couldn't completely overcome the structural inequalities that defined Russian society. At 82, Leo Tolstoy made the most decisive act of his entire philosophical journey. In the early hours of October 28, 1910, he left his ancestral estate at Yasnaya Polyana forever, abandoning his family, his property, and the comfortable contradictions that had tormented him for decades. This was not the impulsive gesture of an elderly man, but the logical culmination of a lifetime spent wrestling with the gap between conviction and conduct. For years, Tolstoy had grown increasingly frustrated with his inability to live according to his own teachings. How could he preach the abolition of private property whilst maintaining vast estates? How could he advocate simple living whilst surrounded by the luxury of aristocratic privilege? The contradictions had become unbearable. His departure was carefully planned, executed in secrecy to avoid the family conflicts that would inevitably follow. He left behind a letter for his wife, explaining that he could no longer live in luxury whilst preaching poverty, could no longer maintain property whilst advocating its complete abolition. The pain this caused his family was immense, the shock to Russian society profound, but Tolstoy had finally found the courage to align his life completely with his convictions. This was authentic existence, demanding its due, regardless of personal cost or social consequences. The old Count had chosen spiritual consistency over domestic peace, philosophical integrity over comfortable compromise. The symbolic power of where Tolstoy died cannot be overstated. He fell ill during his journey and died at Astapovo railway station, literally caught between worlds. Here was the apostle of simple living, dying in a railway station, that quintessential symbol of modern industrial civilization he had spent decades critiquing. The irony was perfect and profound. This man, who had sought to escape the artificial arrangements of modern society, found his final moments surrounded by the very machinery of progress he had rejected. The railway station embodied his liminal position. No longer part of the aristocratic world he had abandoned, not yet arrived at the simple, natural existence he sought. Even in death, the contradictions persisted with haunting clarity. Despite his desire for privacy and simplicity, his final days became a media spectacle. Reporters, government officials, and curious onlookers gathered at the small station, drawn by the fame of the dying Count. The very celebrity he had tried to escape followed him to his deathbed. Yet this setting captured something essential about Tolstoy's philosophical position. He had spent his life pointing toward possibilities that transcended both the old world of privilege and the new world of industrial progress. The railway station, suspended between destinations, became the perfect metaphor for his spiritual geography. Tolstoy's death provided final testimony to his conviction that spiritual considerations must take precedence over material ones. The worldwide attention his death received, newspapers across the globe reporting on the final days of the Count, who had abandoned wealth to die as a wanderer, vindicated his teaching that meaning comes not from mach and scream, external achievements, but from the integrity of one's relationship to ultimate truth. His funeral drew an extraordinary gathering: peasants and intellectuals, believers and skeptics, Russians and foreigners, all united in honoring someone who had sacrificed everything for spiritual consistency. The manner of his dying completed his philosophical journey with stunning clarity. From aristocratic privilege to spiritual poverty, from social success to authentic seeking, Tolstoy had demonstrated the possibility of radical personal transformation. His final departure proved that one could indeed abandon the artificial arrangements of civilization in pursuit of genuine existence. The old Count died, as he had learned to live in his final decades, according to his deepest convictions, regardless of cost. This completion of his philosophical arc, the integration of life and teaching, achieved through ultimate sacrifice, offered the world a model of what it means to live with absolute spiritual integrity. Part 9. The Global Influence, from Gandhi to King. Gandhi discovered Tolstoy's "The Kingdom of God is Within You" during his early legal career in South Africa. and this encounter provided precisely the theoretical foundation he needed for resistance to injustice. The young Gandhi found himself in an impossible position, a Western-educated lawyer facing systematic racial discrimination, searching desperately for a way to oppose injustice without reproducing the violence and hatred that created it. Traditional methods of resistance seem to offer only two choices: passive submission to oppression or violent rebellion that would merely replace one form of domination with another. Tolstoy's book offered exactly what Gandhi needed: a philosophical framework that made non-violent resistance not just morally superior but practically effective. Gandhi later testified that this book overwhelmed him, providing the missing piece in his understanding of how to fight injustice without becoming unjust. Tolstoy's Christian Anarchism gave Gandhi the confidence that non-violent resistance was not passive submission, but active spiritual force, capable of transforming both opponents and society. The Russian Count's analysis of government as organized violence applied perfectly to colonial rule, whilst his vision of the kingdom of God within offered an alternative source of authority that no earthly power could corrupt or destroy. The correspondence between the aging Russian Count and the young Indian lawyer became a remarkable exchange of ideas about non-violent resistance as practical political strategy. Their letters, written across vast distances of geography and culture, explored the practical applications of spiritual principles to political problems with extraordinary depth and mutual respect. Tolstoy encouraged Gandhi's experiments with satyagraha, or truth force, whilst Gandhi reported on the results of applying Tolstoyan principles to anti-colonial struggle. Each letter deepened their shared understanding of how moral force could be translated into political action. Tolstoy, near the end of his life, found in Gandhi proof that his ideas could work beyond the Russian context. The old aristocrat had spent decades developing his philosophy of non-violent resistance, but Gandhi was actually implementing these principles on a massive scale. Gandhi, meanwhile, gained enormous confidence from Tolstoy's support for his innovative methods. The correspondence demonstrated the universal applicability of non-violent principles. Insights developed in one cultural context could be successfully adapted to completely different circumstances and challenges. Tolstoy's Christian Anarchism provided the missing theoretical foundation for Gandhi's Hindu-inspired anti-colonial struggle, creating a synthesis that proved the universal nature of non-violent principles. Gandhi adapted Tolstoyan insights about the kingdom of God being within you to Hindu concepts of satyagraha and ahimsa, showing how different religious traditions could support the same practical approach to social change. The Russians' analysis of government as organized violence merged seamlessly with Hindu understanding of karma and dharma, whilst Tolstoy's vision of voluntary cooperation offered an alternative to both colonial domination and violent revolution. This synthesis proved that non-violent resistance was not culturally specific, but based on universal human capacities for moral growth and spiritual transformation. Gandhi's recognition of these universal principles enabled him to adapt Tolstoyan methods to Indian conditions whilst maintaining their essential character. The result was a form of resistance that drew strength from both Christian and Hindu sources without being limited by either tradition. Gandhi's successful application of Tolstoyan principles to Indian independence demonstrated that these ideas could work on a massive scale, influencing millions of people and ultimately defeating one of the world's most powerful empires through moral force rather than military might. The correspondence between Tolstoy and Gandhi thus represents more than an exchange of ideas between two remarkable individuals. It demonstrates how philosophical insights, when grounded in genuine spiritual understanding, can transcend cultural boundaries and transform political realities through the power of moral conviction. Martin Luther King Jr.'s encounter with Tolstoy's writings marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of nonviolent resistance, creating a synthesis that would transform American society. King discovered Tolstoy not directly, but through Gandhi's explicit acknowledgement of the Russians' influence on his own philosophy of satyagraha. This intellectual lineage proved crucial. King recognized that the same principles which had dismantled British colonialism in India could be applied to racial segregation in America, but with a distinctly Christian theological foundation that Tolstoy's orthodox mysticism provided. King found, "In the kingdom of God is within you," a theological justification for civil disobedience that spoke directly to American Christian conscience in ways that Gandhi's Hindu framework could not. Tolstoy's insight that resist not evil doesn't mean passive acceptance of injustice, but rather refusing to employ the oppressor's methods of violence and hatred became central to civil rights strategy. This interpretation allowed King to maintain that nonviolent resistance was not weakness, but the highest form of moral courage, requiring greater strength than physical retaliation. The synthesis created a uniquely American form of resistance that combined Tolstoy's spiritual insights, Gandhi's practical methods, and indigenous traditions of African American faith and resistance. Tolstoy's analysis of government as organized violence provided civil rights leaders with a philosophical framework for understanding segregation as a system maintained through systematic coercion. This insight transformed their approach to unjust laws. Legal segregation was not merely unfortunate policy, but institutionalized violence that demanded moral resistance. The Montgomery bus boycott exemplified Tolstoyan economic non-cooperation, whilst sit-ins represented refusal to participate in segregated institutions, and freedom rides constituted direct challenges to unjust authority. Each campaign embodied Tolstoy's conviction that individual conscience must take precedence over legal obligation when laws contradict moral truth. The movement's training sessions revealed the profound influence of Tolstoyan principles on civil rights methodology. Activists learned to respond to violence with love, to hatred with compassion, embodying Tolstoy's teaching that the kingdom of God is within you and must be manifested through personal behavior. This preparation reflected Tolstoy's understanding that external change requires internal transformation, that social revolution begins with individual moral development. Participants underwent spiritual and psychological conditioning that enabled them to maintain non-violent discipline under extreme provocation, demonstrating that political action could simultaneously serve as spiritual practice. This approach vindicated Tolstoy's belief that authentic social transformation requires changing consciousness as well as institutions. The civil rights movement succeeded not merely in altering laws but in transforming hearts, proving that moral example carries greater power than political argument in creating lasting change. The movement demonstrated that individual moral transformation could translate into collective political action, that personal spiritual development and social reform are inseparable aspects of authentic revolution. By embodying Tolstoyan principles in American soil, civil rights leaders created a form of resistance that changed both oppressor and oppressed, establishing nonviolent direct action as a permanent feature of democratic social change. Tolstoy's critique of materialism and industrial civilization anticipated our contemporary environmental crisis with startling prescience. Writing in the 19th century, he recognized that industrial production and consumer culture create artificial needs that demand endless exploitation of natural resources and human labor, making sustainability impossible within a system predicated on perpetual growth and material accumulation. His insight that the pursuit of luxury and convenience inevitably leads to environmental destruction remains devastatingly accurate. We treat nature as raw material for human consumption rather than as a living system deserving respect and care. This recognition emerged from his broader understanding of how artificial desires multiply endlessly, creating what we now recognize as the psychological and environmental costs of consumer capitalism. Tolstoy saw that manufactured needs generate perpetual dissatisfaction and competitive consumption. His experiments with simple living, manual labor, local production, and voluntary poverty offer practical models for contemporary movements towards sustainable living and reduced consumption. Contemporary environmental movements have rediscovered these Tolstoyan principles without always acknowledging their source. Voluntary simplicity, bioregionalism, and appropriate technology represent ways of living that meet genuine human needs without destroying the natural world. His advocacy for focusing on authentic needs rather than manufactured desires speaks directly to current concerns about climate change and ecological collapse, suggesting that technical solutions alone cannot address the underlying values and lifestyle choices driving environmental destruction. His philosophy of simplicity provides a framework that addresses both spiritual emptiness and environmental crisis simultaneously. Where contemporary environmentalism often focuses on policy changes or technological innovation, Tolstoy recognized that the environmental problem stems from a deeper spiritual crisis, the belief that material accumulation can provide meaning and satisfaction. His integration of spiritual and environmental concerns offers guidance that goes beyond surface-level reforms to examine the fundamental assumptions of industrial civilization. Tolstoy's anarchist critique of state power speaks with equal relevance to contemporary concerns about government surveillance, military spending, and corporate influence on democratic institutions. His analysis of government as organized violence illuminates current debates about police brutality, military intervention, and the prison-industrial complex. His insight that voluntary cooperation and mutual aid offer alternatives to both state control and corporate domination continues to inspire movements for community, self-organization, and direct democracy. Most significantly, his integration of personal and political transformation provides guidance for social movements, seeking authentic change through prefigurative politics, embodying the values they seek to promote, rather than using oppressive means to achieve liberatory ends. His life, example of sacrificing privilege for principle, demonstrates that individual transformation and social change represent inseparable aspects of revolutionary practice, offering inspiration for contemporary activists seeking to align their personal lives with their political commitments in an age of unprecedented global challenges. Part 10. The synthesis. Love as the meaning of life. Tolstoy's desperate question, "What is the meaning of life?" found its answer not through philosophical argument but through lived revelation. After years of intellectual torment and suicidal despair, he discovered that love alone made existence meaningful. This wasn't mere sentiment or wishful thinking. When he observed his own experience carefully, Tolstoy recognized that every moment when life felt genuinely worthwhile involved love, feeling compassion for suffering humanity. In these moments, the terror of death simply vanished, not because he forgot mortality, but because he experienced something larger than his individual existence. This discovery transformed everything. Life seemed meaningless only when viewed from the prison of isolated selfhood, but became infinitely significant when experienced as participation in universal love. Tolstoy realized that his existential crisis had emerged from a fundamental error, treating individual existence as complete in itself, rather than recognizing it as part of something immeasurably greater. The separate self, cut off from love. But consciousness aligned with love discovers purpose that transcends personal circumstances entirely. Love revealed itself to Tolstoy as far more than human emotion or personal attachment. It operates as the cosmic principle that draws all existence toward unity and harmony. Just as gravity pulls physical objects together according to natural law, love draws conscious beings toward identification with each other and with the whole of existence. This made love both personal experience and universal force. Individual acts of compassion participate in and express the cosmic energy that is gradually unifying all life. Moral development follows this natural law as inevitably as water flows downhill. This understanding provided Tolstoy with unshakable meaning that survived all external circumstances. Personal success or failure, social recognition or rejection, became irrelevant because individual life gained significance through alignment with love's universal movement. His ethics, politics, aesthetics, and social criticism all flowed from this central insight. Human institutions and practices are meaningful only insofar as they serve love's cosmic purpose of drawing all beings toward unity and mutual care. The expansion of love follows natural stages that represent both personal spiritual development and participation in cosmic evolution. Self-love, proper care for one's own well-being, naturally extends to family love as consciousness recognizes its connection with those closest to it. This circle of concern grows to include community, nation, and ultimately all humanity. Tolstoy discovered that this expansion isn't forced moral obligation but organic spiritual growth. As consciousness develops, it naturally identifies with larger and larger portions of existence. This process culminates in identification with divine love itself, the universal force that seeks the welfare of all beings without exception. Individual existence becomes conscious participation in cosmic purpose, making personal life meaningful precisely through its service to something infinitely greater than itself. Death loses its terror because it represents not destruction but completion. The separate self dissolves into the universal love that was always its true nature, making mortality not ending, but fulfillment of life's deepest purpose. Tolstoy's final philosophical vision rested upon a mystical insight that transformed his understanding of reality itself, the recognition that all existence participates in a single, universal life that manifests through countless individual forms. This wasn't merely an abstract philosophical concept for him, but a lived reality that could be experienced directly through love, compassion, and spiritual practice. The apparent separation between individuals, he came to understand, is ultimately illusory. At the deepest level of consciousness, all beings share in one divine life, one universal love that expresses itself through the multiplicity of creation. This insight provided the metaphysical foundation for his entire ethical and political system. If all beings are ultimately one, then harming others is literally harming oneself, whilst serving others is serving one's deepest self. The ethics of non-violence and the politics of mutual aid weren't arbitrary moral rules imposed from outside, but practical applications of the fundamental truth that existence is interconnected and interdependent. When Tolstoy looked upon a peasant suffering from poverty or witnessed the violence of the state, he saw not separate individuals experiencing distant misfortunes, but manifestations of the same universal life that he himself embodied. This understanding completely resolved his original existential crisis about death and meaninglessness. Fear of death, he realized, arises from identifying oneself with the temporary physical body and separate personality, rather than with the eternal love that is one's deepest nature. When consciousness expands to identify with universal love, rather than individual ego, death becomes not the end of existence but simply a change of form, like a wave returning to the ocean from which it arose. His own approaching death became not a source of terror but an opportunity for final liberation from the illusion of separateness. The resolution was profound and complete. Life has infinite meaning because individual existence participates in eternal love, and death cannot destroy what is eternal. The meaning of life is love itself, not love as emotion or sentiment, but love as the fundamental reality underlying all apparent diversity and separation. This love expresses itself through compassion for all beings, through the recognition that serving others is the highest form of self-realization, and through the understanding that one's individual life gains significance only insofar as it contributes to the universal life of which it forms part. This metaphysical insight grounded his ethical and political positions in ultimate reality rather than mere human convention. His commitment to non-violence flowed directly from recognition that violence against others is violence against the universal self that manifests through all individual forms. His anarchist politics reflected the same insight. Coercive government is based on the illusion of separation, whilst voluntary cooperation expresses the underlying unity of all existence. Property and wealth inequality violated the fundamental interconnectedness of all life. Hoarding resources, whilst others suffer, denies the truth that all beings participate in the same cosmic process and deserve equal respect and care. His advocacy of simple living and manual labor expressed this same recognition. The aristocratic life he had abandoned was based on the false premise that some individuals are separate from and superior to others. True life required acknowledging one's participation in the universal community of being, which meant sharing in the common labor necessary for survival and refusing to exploit others' work for personal advantage. This made his entire philosophical system coherent and unified. Ethics, politics, aesthetics, and spirituality all flowed from the single insight that love is the fundamental reality. Art should express this universal love rather than personal vanity. Politics should facilitate voluntary cooperation rather than impose artificial divisions. Ethics should cultivate compassion rather than enforce abstract rules. Spirituality should recognize the divine presence in all beings rather than seek personal salvation. The Great Awakening was the recognition that separation is illusion and love is truth, not as comforting belief, but as the deepest fact about reality itself. Tolstoy's final philosophical insight cut through decades of intellectual struggle with startling simplicity. Meaning exists not in future rewards or historical outcomes, but in the present moment of moral choice. This revelation transformed his understanding of human purpose from something to be achieved into something to be lived, moment by moment, through alignment with love. The search for meaning in external results had tormented him for years. Personal success felt hollow, social reform seemed futile, and even his literary achievements appeared insignificant against the backdrop of human suffering and death. He had pursued meaning through intellectual accomplishment, through attempts at social change, through religious conversion. Yet, each external goal, once achieved, revealed its own limitations. Success was temporary, reforms were incomplete, and even spiritual insights could become sources of pride rather than transformation. This endless cycle of striving and disappointment finally broke when Tolstoy recognized that meaning resides not in outcomes, but in the quality of present action. The choice between love and hatred, truth and deception, compassion and cruelty carries infinite value, regardless of its consequences. A moment of genuine kindness towards a difficult person, an act of honesty that brings personal cost, a choice to respond with understanding rather than anger. These decisions create meaning through their very existence, not through their results. This understanding liberated him from the impossible burden of controlling outcomes, whilst making every moment infinitely significant. He no longer needed to reform society to find purpose. Purpose existed in each choice to treat others with dignity. He no longer needed to achieve immortality through his works. Immortality existed in each moment of alignment with eternal love. The present became sacred not as a stepping stone to future fulfillment, but as the only realm where meaning actually exists. External circumstances lost their power to determine his sense of purpose once this inner transformation occurred. Happiness and meaning depended not on what happened to him, but on how he responded to what happened. His capacity to maintain love, compassion, and inner peace, regardless of external conditions, became the foundation of true freedom, a freedom no external force could destroy. Political liberty, economic security, and social recognition were revealed as temporary and dependent on circumstances beyond individual control. But the freedom to choose love in each moment remained always available, always meaningful. This insight made him increasingly indifferent to external success or failure, social approval or criticism, comfort or hardship. His sense of identity and worth came from inner alignment with love rather than external achievements. This spiritual freedom provided the foundation for his political anarchism. Once inner freedom is achieved, external authority loses its power to coerce because the person's sense of meaning no longer depends on social approval or material security. The state's power rests on its ability to threaten what people value: their reputation, their comfort, their lives. But when meaning comes from present moral choice rather than future outcomes, these threats lose their force. The ultimate expression of this philosophy emerged in Tolstoy's understanding of unconditional love as the highest form of human agency. The decision to love, even when love is not returned, even when it brings suffering, even when it seems futile, represents the one choice that is always available and always meaningful. This choice to love unconditionally makes humans truly free and truly human, representing the triumph of spirit over circumstance, of moral agency over external determination. His final years embodied this insight. Despite their difficulties and apparent failures, the conflicts with his family, the criticism from former supporters, the sense of isolation from both religious and revolutionary movements, they became the most meaningful of his life because they represented the most complete alignment of his choices with love. Each day offered countless opportunities to choose compassion over resentment, understanding over judgment, peace over conflict. This insight provides the ultimate resolution to his philosophical journey. The meaning of life is found in the eternal present of moral action, where each moment offers the opportunity to choose love over fear, unity over separation, truth over illusion. This choice, multiplied across countless individuals and moments, becomes the force that gradually transforms both individual consciousness and collective human experience, making personal spiritual development and social evolution inseparable aspects of love's cosmic work. Part 11. Tolstoy's philosophical journey reveals a profound truth about how genuine wisdom emerges from lived experience rather than abstract speculation. His path from aristocratic privilege through existential crisis to spiritual awakening demonstrates that the deepest insights arise when we possess the courage to follow our convictions to their ultimate conclusions, regardless of personal cost. Each stage of his development, the comfortable aristocrat questioning inherited values, the despairing seeker confronting meaninglessness, the converted believer discovering divine love, the social critic exposing civilization's contradictions, the anarchist rejecting state violence, represents a necessary step in a coherent vision that transforms individual crisis into universal wisdom. His existential crisis provided the foundation for everything that followed. The aristocrat who had enjoyed every privileged society often discovered that external success could not answer the fundamental question of life's meaning. This despair, which nearly drove him to suicide, became the catalyst for a religious conversion that revealed love as the organizing principle of authentic existence. His spiritual awakening generated inevitable social criticism. You cannot truly love whilst participating in systems that harm others. This criticism produced his political philosophy of Christian anarchism. Genuine love requires rejecting all forms of violence and coercion. The progression demonstrates how personal transformation and social reform are inseparable when grounded in authentic spiritual insight. Tolstoy's ultimate answer resolves both individual and social problems through a single insight. Life's meaning is found through love that transcends individual ego and identifies with universal good. This discovery addresses every question that had tormented him. Individual existence gains meaning through participation in eternal love rather than temporary pleasure or achievement. Death loses its terror when consciousness identifies with the universal rather than the personal. Social problems find their solution through expanding love from narrow self-interest to concern for all humanity. You cannot authentically love yourself whilst hating others, and you cannot love others genuinely whilst supporting systems that oppress them. This understanding provides practical guidance for contemporary challenges that seem overwhelming in their complexity. Environmental crisis, social inequality, political corruption, and spiritual emptiness all stem from the same source: identification with separate ego rather than recognition of universal connection. They find their solution through the same process of expanding consciousness and compassion. Climate change results from treating nature as separate from ourselves. Economic injustice emerges from believing our well-being is independent of others' suffering. Political violence stems from imagining that our security requires others' defeat. Spiritual emptiness follows from seeking meaning in temporary pleasures rather than eternal love. His lasting legacy through the global movements he influenced proves that spiritual insight and political action are inseparable when grounded in authentic philosophy. Gandhi's independence movement, King's civil rights campaign, and contemporary movements for social and environmental justice all demonstrate how personal transformation becomes social change when individuals align their lives with universal principles rather than narrow interests. These movements succeed not through hatred of opponents, but through love that transforms both oppressor and oppressed. Tolstoy's life example continues inspiring individuals seeking to align personal lives with deepest values, because he proved that individual integrity and social responsibility are different aspects of the same commitment to truth, love. His journey from wealth to voluntary poverty, from despair to joy, from individual crisis to universal service, offers a model for how personal awakening becomes social transformation when grounded in recognition that all existence is ultimately one. His willingness to sacrifice social position and personal comfort for the sake of living according to his convictions demonstrates that authentic philosophy requires courage to embody our insights rather than merely understand them intellectually. The great awakening Tolstoy experienced and embodied shows that genuine wisdom emerges when we stop seeking meaning in external achievements and discover it through love that connects us with the eternal source of all existence. This awakening transforms both individual life and social relationships because it reveals that our deepest well-being depends on the well-being of all. His philosophical vision remains vital because it addresses the fundamental human need for meaning whilst providing practical guidance for creating a world based on love rather than fear, cooperation rather than competition, service rather than exploitation.